Here I'd like to look at the conclusion of William Faulkner's The Unvanquished and kind of reconsider the process by which Bayard becomes his father's son, the Sartoris, in the novel. This last part of the novel occurs in a reconstructed South after the American Civil War, as Bayard notes here that these are strange times. A world of burned towns, of ruined plantations and fields inhabited only by women. A new foe has appeared whose means we could not always fathom. This new foe is those opportunists who have come into the South to try to gain economic and political advantage over the region in the wake of the war. This is also the space in which Bayard and Ringo and perhaps Drusilla come to adulthood in this kind of ravaged space. They come to know themselves more fully. You could read this history that unfolds in Faulkner's novel in a series of coats in some ways. You have John Sartoris's uniform returning. As he returns from the war, Bayard smells it on page 10, and in it he smells the smell of powder and glory. So the sense of warfare being that kind of romantic space in which men become men. This later changes to Grumby's gray coat, which reeks of flight as the war unwinds and the South is defeated, and that coat smells of horse sweat and wood smoke and grease, and as Grumby ravages the countryside in his own manner. And then Bayard's coat later, as he goes to his father's funeral, that still smells with the scent of Drusilla's verbena, faint from where my coat lay on a chair. Drusilla welcomes him when he comes home for the funeral, with these sprigs of flowers in her hair, that very fragrant flowers that were used in traditionally at funerals to kind of cover the scent of the body's slow decay. So in what ways is Drusilla covering the scent of John's body's decay, as well as perhaps the South's own body's decay in this changing time? Some things you might want to think about as you read the second part of the novel, how Faulkner retells the South here. Kind of rethink those slippery identities and lineages that I've introduced in the first part of the novel. How people are related, and how their displaced circumstances kind of redefine the characters here in the close of the Civil War. You can read this novel with a more kind of Marxist perspective as well, and kind of think about how the plantation system itself defines Bayard and Ringo in terms of economic class, and how it defines Granny and John and Drusilla as well, perhaps more so than race does in the end. Which comes first in the end? Is it the plantation system, or the ways in which race is thought in this South? As I've encouraged throughout this novel, think about what's left unsaid in Faulkner's novel. You can read this as a racist novel that's acted out on black bodies, where African American characters are not seen as fully real in some ways, perhaps. You can also kind of think about what it is that Faulkner has not said in the novel. How African American characters, particularly Ringo, how his consciousness redefines Bayard's telling of this South. If you do that, you can kind of begin to dig into the South's historical subconscious here, and think about how Bayard is trying to understand honor and what it is to be an adult, to be a man, against the changing conventions of race, class, family, gender, and sexuality in a redefined South. In what ways is Bayard's world defined by some unresolved griefs of loss or surrender or change, and how do those define the way that he tells this space? A few lines of narrative that you can explore as you think through this novel. First, the South as a lost cause. We are, in the reconstructed South at the end of the novel, and at the end of the Civil War, in which people are struggling against hunger and uncertainty and grief. This is a devastated space economically, socially. You have released slaves who are now kind of trying to build and construct a sense of life and identity in a very difficult space. And so how do characters define themselves within that lostness? Granny develops a plan to steal and resell mules to Northern troops in the midst of that, to kind of help feed people around her, to establish some sort of security for Bayard and for John. And so she develops this plan where she uses Ab Snopes as kind of a go-between, and then she utilizes Ringo to do a lot of the legwork in finding these mules and then taking them for resale to the northern base. Her plan unravels, and as she's found out, she's caught, and she offers this prayer of for forgiveness, of repentance here, and where she prays that she sinned, that I sinned for more than justice, she says, pages 146, 147. I sinned for those who had given their sons to a holy cause, even though you have seen fit to make it a lost cause. So there's kind of a sense of regret and frustration and anger that's underneath that prayer that Granny gives as she tries to find a way to live in the midst of this devastation. It's from this plan, when she goes to claim her share from Snopes, that she's actually murdered. And she goes, with a full sense that Southern men will not give up their honor, even in defeat. She tells the boys as she goes, even Yankees do not harm old women. And this sets up the confrontation that we don't see narrated in the novel, but is the thing that drives the second part of the novel, where Granny is actually murdered by these men. So that sets up Bayard's kind of quest, or sense of trying to gain payback. And it's on this quest that he becomes an adult in the end. He goes to take revenge on Grumby's Independents, a group of raiders who are ravaging the countryside and committing acts of racial violence. They're involved in Granny's murder, and Bayard wants to go and take revenge on Grumby for that. As he and Ringo and the Caslins travel pursuing Grumby, they come upon the scene of a lynching, an African-American man's body hung from a tree, a warning note that's attached to it. Grumby writes, "Take my advice and turn back, and someday become a man. Refuse it and cease even to be a child." So the threat is there, right? That, in the wake of the war, these are irregular soldiers who are, living out their lives in this devastated space, and have kind of thrown away all sense of honor in the interest of survival. They do track Grumby down, and as he and Ringo confront Grumby, Grumby fires on Bayard, and then Bayard narrates, "And then it happened. Even now I don't know how I saw Ringo in the air, his open pocket knife in his hand." And this is where the boys kill Grumby. Although, it's interesting that Bayard can't connect all the details within the act of violence itself, and how Grumby is brought to justice by them. We get the narration of the boys' return, and we discover that Grumby's body has been found pegged to a shed door with its right hand missing, and that right hand has been cut off and left on Granny's grave. So it's really interesting in terms of what Bayard doesn't tell here, so what's left untold in the novel on page 183 in the midst of this, savage act of violence against Grumby, this savage act of revenge, and the act of dismemberment. And my question in reading this novel is, Bayard doesn't tell the story, but do you read this as the act of dismemberment being done by Bayard or Ringo? Ringo is the one with a knife in his hand, and if Ringo accomplishes the act of revenge in that way, what does that say about his sense of relationship to Granny? I've encouraged you to think about how you read this novel differently if Bayard and Ringo are brothers, both sons of John. In what ways does that change your view of Ringo if he is the one who commits the act of revenge ultimately in the end? It's within this act of revenge that Bayard becomes the Sartoris, right? He becomes the son of John, as Uncle Buck says when he finds the dismembered body with the missing hand. He says, "Ain't I told you he is John Sartoris's boy?" interesting, right? He says that, and is he referring to Bayard, or perhaps unwittingly speaking of Ringo at this point? If you read the novel from that standpoint, we move within the novel at this point to the reconstructed South, and the appearance of carpetbaggers, outsiders who have come in to kind of take economic advantage of the space here. John Sartoris fights back against these opportunists, commits acts of violence against them, which lead to him later being killed in a duel. This is also the space in which Ringo kind of redefines his identity within the novel. He goes to Bayard and he says to him, "Do you know what I ain't? I ain't an N anymore. I done been abolished." And so he has a slip of paper that identifies him as someone who's been freed. And so Bayard's sense of response to this is interesting, because how does he start to see Ringo differently perhaps here? As I said, John Sartoris is killed in a duel out of the politics of Reconstruction, and Drusilla calls Bayard home from college. We've passed a couple years here. She brings him home and then hands him the pistols with which he is supposed to go gain revenge for his father's death. On page 227, 228, you get the narration of her charge to Bayard, saying, you've got to go do this for your father. And she says that there are worse things than killing men, and then she seals this by saying, "Kiss me, Bayard." And so you have this great moment in the novel where Drusilla, claims a different kind of space and relationship with Bayard. Also, in this space, you see that Bayard calls Ringo "my boy." So there's a sense of, in what ways does he see his relationship differently with Ringo after the war? But he also realizes at that point, I would never be the Sartoris to Ringo. And maybe it was because he had outgrown me. So in what ways has Ringo kind of claimed a separate identity from Bayard, either as brothers, or as friends in the wake of the war, depending on how you read it. Also, you can reread Drusilla's place within the novel. There's a lot of interesting things that are developing in her character as the novel goes on, as she moves from grieving her fiancé Gavin, who's killed at Shiloh, we learn earlier in the novel, to joining John Sartoris' detachment, where she rides astride like a man, to the point of her grief over John Sartoris' death. Late in the novel, Bayard will recall a moment where she is with him, where she has changed but little since, with the same boy-hard body, this close, implacable head with its savagely cropped hair. She told me, "A dream is like a loaded pistol." In what ways does Drusilla's dream kind of plant that violence in Bayard that he tries to transact or transcend as the South moves from war to Reconstruction? That's the story of Faulkner's novel.